"Scott, just look," Eva exclaimed, interrupting Scott's reading. She held a strange-looking doll in her hands, with messy hair and a face smeared with who knows what. Cracks were visible in some places, and 2 large teeth protruded from its mouth, strongly resembling human teeth. The torn and crumpled clothes, tiny limbs with crooked fingers. This doll seemed to have escaped from a horror movie, the cheapest one where such toys are made to be as scary and ugly as possible to induce fear. "He's not very pretty," Scott replied somewhat softly, trying not to offend his wife. "You don't understand anything?" Eva held the doll close, hugging it tightly. "Well, yes, of course." It had been a year since their 5-year-old son died. The parents weren't paying attention. The boy ran across the road to see the dogs, and then the pack didn't show any friendliness, attacking the child and killing him. And something about the doll's face reminded them of their son at that moment, red, battered, with 2 protruding big teeth among the flesh. Only the doll seemed to have dipped its face in a pile of crap and rejoiced afterwards. "Aren't you happy? Our little one came back." "Of course, dear. I'm very happy." Eva stared at her husband intently, stroking the doll. Scott returned to his book. Of course, he was in pain from losing his son, but going to such extremes wasn't his thing. It only made things worse, like picking at an old wound. And the thought that his beloved wife had gone crazy didn't make the situation any better. "You're not happy, Scott. You really don't care." He didn't pay attention to how she left. He simply listened to her loud footsteps and sobs. Then the sound of a door slamming. And silence. Scott put down his book and closed his eyes. There were no tears left, but he wanted to cry. Soon he would lose his wife too. A week later, Eva finally came out of the room. She still held the doll close to her. Scott tried not to look at the creepy replacement for their son. They simply talked peacefully about how they would spend the weekend. Summer was in full swing. Why not have a picnic? They hadn't been out in nature for a while to freshen up and relax from the city bustle. Scott wanted to mention the doll, but he didn't start the conversation. He didn't want to upset his wife again. Maybe she would play with it for a while, and then everything would pass. At least Scott hoped so. When the weekend came, they all gathered together. Scott, Eva, and son. A very strange picture emerged. The couple laughed, talked, ate delicious food, as it should be done at a picnic. But a creepy-looking doll sat next to them and watched. It watched the happy couple, birds and small animals. It listened to what they said, the singing and rustling of the grass. It felt the moments of wind. The doll seemed alive, or pretended to be. Life gradually improved. Eva was able to calm down thanks to the doll. Scott stopped being annoyed by his lover's behavior, sometimes even playing with son himself. This is happiness. The family is now complete, if you can call it that. Life doesn't seem so gray anymore. But everything is just beginning. Just when everything was getting better, another disaster appeared. Eva began to weaken. Every day it became worse and worse. Scott even took time off work to be with his sick wife. Doctors just shrugged their shoulders, prescribing some medicines that didn't help Eva recover. The doll was there all this time. It watched the poor girl suffer, and the only medicine keeping Eva sane and in her senses. Scott was glad of this. At least his beloved was fighting for her life somehow. Soon Eva began to hallucinate. She called for her son, loudly screaming and moaning. In those moments, her body twisted. That's when Scott noticed something strange on his wife's body. Above her navel was a perfectly round wound, covered with a hard crust of flesh and slightly convex. Something pulsated under the crust. Scott cautiously touched the wound, but his wife stopped him immediately, holding his wrist tightly, which surprised Scott. For a moment, Eva became normal, glaring at her husband and saying through gritted teeth, "Don't touch." Afterwards, his wife's skin turned gray, and she looked sickly. Scott couldn't believe what was happening. His intuition told him that something was definitely wrong. Life began to resemble a horror movie. Scott quit his job and stayed home all day, all in an effort to bring his wife back. She wasn't the Eva he knew. She had become insane, skinny and gray, like someone with the plague, a pitiful semblance of a human being. And that doll. Eva never parted with it for a second. Scott tried to take the creepy toy away, but Eva wouldn't let him. It was too late to try to get rid of the doll. Scott didn't want to turn to any specialists. He wasn't ready to admit that everything that was happening was beyond any human laws. Maybe his intuition was deceiving him. Maybe it was all a terrible dream. If only. Scott had already given up. He was lost and didn't know what to do. And he gradually turned into a pitiful semblance of a human being himself as he started drinking since the beginning of all these events. The only solution to all his problems became cheap booze. Soon it would run out too, as the budget wasn't infinite to spend on alcohol. At times they all got together. Scott, Eva, and their son, like in the good old days. They sat in the living room in complete silence, each in their own projection. The light hadn't been turned on in a long time, and there was practically no food left. Only empty bottles, excrement, and vomit. The smell of urine had become so stagnant that it had become an air freshener analog. Eva played with her son, telling him various stories. Scott didn't pay attention to it. He even forgot that he wasn't alone. And during one of these gatherings, Scott noticed something. When he looked at the doll, it seemed to him that the toy was starting to grow into something resembling flesh. Not quite. The plastic, or whatever this doll was made of, was crumbling, and naked flesh was appearing from under the open spots. Even the black eyes fell out, and real human eyes of a murky color replaced them. Teeth became visible, and the hair had noticeably grown, and the doll itself had become slightly larger. The funniest thing was that Scott didn't react to it at all. He blamed it all on the fact that he had drunk himself to such a degree. The dolls had turned into real children. One fine day, Scott heard some very strange sounds that woke him up from his sleep, as if someone was greedily sucking up the remains of juice. Scott decided to check if he was imagining things. He took the chair standing nearby as protection. Holding his weapon tightly in his hands, Scott went into the living room. The sounds were coming from his wife's room. Heading there, Scott carefully put his ear to the door. His hand slowly rested on the door handle. Pressing it slightly and opening the door, Scott burst into the room, ready to attack, but the chair slipped out of his hands. That same doll was sitting on Eva, sucking everything out of her with its long proboscis like a mosquito. The flesh pulsated, releasing transparent slime. The doll's murky eyes roamed around the room until they focused on Scott, who had just entered. The proboscis detached from his wife's body. Now it was a real leather bag with bones. A wide smile appeared from under the proboscis. Something resembling a grotesque fly-human hybrid squeaked loudly, jumping in place. "Now it's your turn, Daddy. I hope you're just as delicious."